Well, this is an exciting episode of Things Hidden. It's going to be action packed. We have with us an action director, no less, who's worked in film and video game industry and has a prolific resume in those industries. He's also a fellow fan of Rene Girard. He's a student of anthropology and Eric Ganz's work. We get into that a little bit. Generative anthropology, which is have some overlap with the field of mimetic theory that we explore on this podcast. But I want to welcome my friend Eric Jacobus with us. How you doing, Eric?
Good. Thank you for having me, David.
Well, it's great to have you again, and it's been a while since we did a discussion. And you have always been someone I really enjoy talking to about these things because media is very important, and we don't, we're seeing the effects of media in our culture. We're seeing bizarre things happening on a cultural level, and it's so hard for people to make sense of it all. And there's become this whole discussion online. They have things like the intellectual dark web, and then they went into something else, and you have channels talking about sense making and how do you have sense making in a time when things falling apart. And there's a thought online that institutions that we have long trusted are no longer able to be believable anymore. And so here we are in the midst of this. You and I are both fans of anthropology, and we try to apply it to contemporary media. So let's do our best to kind of have a free-flowing discussion around that.
Sounds good.
So let's start with, you told me recently, that there's some ways to look at the hidden sacrificial mechanism of media. And you were illustrating some very interesting points in that regard in the field of looking at genres of music like vaporwave and retrowave and all these different things. So let's try to just kind of start cold here. What is the most interesting example of the hidden sacred violence of pop media that you see today, that maybe a low-hanging fruit that we can analyze or explain for people?
Well, I think one of the trends that I've noticed in the past decade or two has been a sort of retconning of the 80s, because in the 80s it was very it was during the crime wave. There was a lot of media that was just very black or white. The heroes killed the bad guys, and there was just no remorse for the bad guys. There wasn't a whole lot of backstory with villains. We're sort of obsessed with villains now in genre films even, but back then it was very black or white. And there's an aesthetic to that. There was a certain kind of musical style that came out of that, the Carpenter style soundtrack, and these other various 80s style riffs and motifs and these melodies that we all have a lot of nostalgia for. And I think that nostalgia, what it's done is it's sort of bred a new kind of music which is trying to reclaim those aesthetics. And what it's doing, though, is it's taking the very black and white 1980s good versus evil concept and flipping it on its head and saying, well, actually, why don't we take the musical concept of the 80s trailer music and of this very kind of Carpenter-esque style of music, but instead we're going to glorify the villain, and we might explain the villain. And this is kind of part of a broader trend you see with movies like Maleficent and even the Friday the 13th movie that Rob Zombie did, where you're sort of retelling these old stories, but instead you're taking the villain and you're sort of making the villain out as if they are the scapegoat, and then you're recasting them as a hero. And so in order to do that, so in Rob Zombie's film, it's not simply that the villain was a homicidal maniac, it's that he was abused by a Christian father who was a Bible-thumping jerk, right? And so then, as a result of that, you have this abused child, and the villain is this sort of status quo from the 80s, which would, I guess you would say, it represents the patriarchy, and that now becomes the scapegoat. But at the same time, you're trying to acquire the aesthetics of that music and that time period and saying that you're recasting it, like you're bringing it back to life, but you're actually inverting the whole thing. And that seems to be the broader trend of retrowave. And I went to a couple of retrowave concerts, and they're very flashy and very interesting. But one thing that I noticed when I went to one is that it has basically taken up the mantle of the metal scene. And because it was mostly metalheads in there, they had very 80s style music, but the imagery was overtly satanic. I mean, I don't even know if they probably thought it was fun. They probably thought it was interesting and kind of cool. As far as I know, these people don't actually worship Satan.
What were the images?
Pentagrams, a lot of pentagrams, a lot of, just various exploitation. There's also the satanic panic from the 80s that they like to reclaim. And there's a whole aesthetic around the satanic panic where the idea was that it was a big joke, or that it was a big con by Christians to try and scapegoat Satanists. And so they have sort of come up and say, well, we're going to reclaim that. We're going to say that the satanic panic was really our culture. And we're going to take all the aesthetics of that and then mix it with the 80s music. And then boom, now we have a movement.
What do you think is, what is the draw for retro wave and this kind of music? And is that separate from the chill hop music? I know it's different, but is it a similar dynamic underlying that? I mean, what's the draw for that? Because it's very popular, and I enjoy some of the music that I've heard on there. And I'm trying to understand: is it just blatant nostalgic sentimentalism that draws that millennial and Gen Z to these types of sounds?
It might be, although I think that there are a lot of people who really enjoy retrowave as nostalgic, even if they weren't born until the mid 90s. What's interesting, I remember being in high school, and I was in high school in the late 90s, and we were already nostalgic for the 80s.
Yeah.
Which is very strange. We were already nostalgic for early 80s music, mid 80s music, and really the 80s aesthetic lasted through the early 90s. And I would say that what made it an 80s aesthetic is that it was very American and sort of localized, because once you had a globalization of culture, which really exploded in the mid 90s with NAFTA and all of these other major trade deals, you sort of lost that tone, that aesthetic. You also lost great trailer art. You lost the great poster art. So DVD covers and posters looked very generic in the mid to late 90s. Everybody became very nostalgic for that 80s time period. So there's something about it which feels very, I guess you could say, sort of almost like it's undefiled. You know what I mean? Like it has a signature on it, and so that style, and it's the same with Japanese art, right? Japanese music, Japanese games, because Japan has a very distinct style that is very local. It's made for Japan. And by and large, that does not translate globally. But then there are some, odd ducks like myself, and I love this stuff. Don't get me wrong, but there is a very defined tone to these aesthetics, and you could call that a sort of paganism, if you want to be, if you want to just put a pin on it and say this is sort of American paganism from the 80s. It's what it looked like. It's what it felt like.
Why would you call it that?
Because they are myths.
Mm-hmm.
There are these myths in media. That's how media works. We have an American myth that sort of updates over time, but by and large, it's remained the same. Korea has a myth. Japan has a myth. The American myth is heavily situated around superheroes and horror films and action films, good versus evil, crime waves. And again, yes, underdogs. Underdogs being a huge one. Perhaps we were one of the pioneers of that genre, and then you start seeing more underdog cinema in societies that we overtake, like Japan. And
what is the difference between an underdog and a scapegoat? An underdog is a vindicated scapegoat. Is that what you?
I would say so. Yeah. I mean, a scapegoat it's almost like you could almost say the court jester is the classical scapegoat, or the double act where you have the straight man and the fall guy. And the fall guy is the scapegoat. And we all sort of side with the straight man because obviously he's taking our side. The fall guy, we're not the fall guy, but we get to laugh at his being expelled, which is what comedy is. Comedy is expulsion.
Can you unpack that a little bit more? I like the way the comedy is expulsion, because that is true. You see these stand-up late night comedians and people like Dave Chappelle have become like the new counter, folk religion. They're battling against the old establishment religion.
Yeah.
Or doing what
Yeah.
they can to walk that line, I guess.
Well, if you take the Girardian or Gansian approach to looking at the history of comedy, you could sort of trace it back to the first scapegoat, the first human scapegoat. So if you're to look at the first human scapegoat, the human sacrifice, the human is killed, he's deified or she is deified, and then there's a myth concocted around the murder so that the murder is not a murder, but it becomes, if we pushed him off a cliff and killed him, then it becomes we pushed him off a cliff and he became an eagle, took away our sins, and then eventually he just became an eagle and took away our sins. And so
Right.
These things morph over time. But the thing is that when you kill your scapegoat, you lose your scapegoat. You can't keep bringing them back.
Yeah.
So if you keep having societal crises, then you keep having to renew a scapegoat. Perhaps the myth doesn't take hold as easily. You actually need to keep killing somebody. And you can't literally kill somebody, so perhaps you can expel them. And laughter is a great expulsion mechanism. So the court jester is somebody that you can assign that duty where they keep coming back and making jokes, and then you as the audience, you can keep expelling the court jester every time, and they're sort of an expert scapegoat. And they're well paid. They're the rodeo clown, like I said, they're the fall guy, they're the heel. They're the ones that keep coming back to get kicked in the teeth. A lot of the time they're the ones that are laughing their way to the bank. This is what Chaplin capitalized off of. This is what Jackie Chan capitalized off of, because they look goofy, they look dumb, but in the end, they're the ones that keep coming back. They're the ones that have the contract going, right? And that's what the court jester was.
But then some of the clowns, scapegoats, they can't take it. Like Chris Farley. He couldn't handle that role.
And you know what? That is a great point, and that is the dark underbelly of comedy right there, because some of the best comedians, people that we love, Peter Sellers, Chaplin, Farley, these guys have dark things going on. Carlin, these people that we laugh at, and Mitch Hedberg is another example. Some of the best comedians. It's horrible because it is essentially a scapegoat culture, twofold. On the one hand, they're taking it on themselves, and on the other hand, there's a lifestyle that they've undertaken in order to be that every day and every time. And in order for them to maintain that, they take a lot of drugs. Their lives are a lot of the time ruining themselves, and a lot of the time it kills them. And then we pretend. I wouldn't even say we pretend. I mean, it's a tragedy every time these people die. But every time that it's happened, I become less and less apt to laugh at people like that, because I'm afraid I'm going to push that. I'm afraid I'm asking for that. You know what I mean?
To laugh at their jokes, you mean?
Yeah, because it's almost as if you kind of have to look beyond it and ask yourself, are they destroying themselves to make me laugh?
Yeah.
And it gives me pause. I love comedy, but
how do you? Is there any signs we can look for to see if it's a healthy comedy? You know what I mean? Like, this doesn't look like it's killing the comedian to be this funny right now.
I think I don't know. I mean, you look at guys like The Rock is funny.
People used to think Bill Cosby was a great example.
I know. And look what was going on behind the scenes there. So that's the thing about comedy, is that a lot of the time it just hides darkness, and it's the best way at hiding darkness, and that's why we like it.
And it's kind of similar to horror too, right? Because horror is an attempt to embrace and laugh at death, right? To laugh at death anxiety.
To laugh at death, to laugh at immorality, and to enjoy immorality. It's a great cover for that.
How is horror cover for immorality? Because you see killings and
stuff? In the traditional horror film, for example, you watch the beginning of Jaws. And what happens at the beginning of Jaws, you have the man and the woman, they're having sex on the beach. And this is traditionally outside of the codes of morality. You're not supposed to be having sex in public. And so the woman, what does she do? She takes her top off, goes into the water, and gets eaten by a shark. And that's justice. And I remember learning this in film school, because I was taught this from a very progressive perspective, which is that the patriarchy runs the media, and they are trying to create these traditional style action films, horror films that are trying to push traditional values, and they punish people for not maintaining those values. And that is true. But then the opposite of that is the thriller, which is a lot of the time the thriller is actually taking in outside ideas and trying to subvert convention. And then you have other kinds of new action films which are trying to, again, they instead of using conservative ideas to attack external ideas. They take external ideas to attack the foundational. I guess you would say, if you say that the powers that be, the current institutions that we live under are corrupt, then we have to take external influences and destroy those, and that's sort of the other side of the equation.
Mm-hmm.
But traditional horror is definitely conservative in that sense.
Was there a time period where the patriarchy lost its ability to run horror and things?
I mean, they sort of. Here's the problem with all of this, right? You look at big studios like MGM, for example, and I recommend a book called The Fixers. MGM, founded by a very conservative man, Louis Mayer, excuse me, and he was very conservative, and he wanted to maintain a very conservative image for his studio in the 20s and 30s, and the audience was very conservative as well. And unfortunately, when you're making films that are paying the equivalent of $10 million per film to the stars in today's money, then you inevitably have a lot of stars coming in who are just miscreants, and they're not playing by the same. They just don't live by the morals that you're trying to show. So you have to hide a lot of this stuff, and a lot of it gets swept under the rug. And so the history of cinema and the history of, what you might consider very conservative and very American, very wholesome entertainment, it's got a lot of players in it who are cheating on their wives, and they were having, they had unwanted children that they got rid of, and there was all kinds of stuff happening. And so inevitably you're going to have people looking at that and saying, well, wait a minute, if you're not going to live by the rules that you're supposedly espousing, then why do I listen to you? And so they lose authority, which I get. So it happened very early on, and I think that unless you can maintain a hold on the media, which MGM tried to do, but eventually it's going to crack open, then you're just going to lose your authority.
Interesting. Do you think I totally agree. It's this idea that kind of a dialectic, like we tried your conventional process, but look at this battered woman, and look at this lost child, and look at this deadbeat dad that didn't take care of the unwanted child. All these different things, they pile up in real life and in behind the scenes, and then that is what allows for people to say, let's make space for the victims of this messed up hypocrisy. Let's make space, let's celebrate, and let's make that the new normative. Is that there is no moral boundary for marriage. There is no, and this is where I get into, is just the interesting thing for me is that political correctness as a religion is at war with differentiation itself.
Exactly.
Because it sees differentiation in Girardian terms, we say differentiation is the occasion. It can be the occasion for sacrifice and exclusion, but it doesn't have to be inherently so.
Exactly.
And the one thing about political correctness is it seems to suggest differentiation is always evil. It's always violent, and therefore we're going to preemptively cast out differentiation. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. I think you nailed it. That was one of the key terms I took away from Girard, was the term differentiation. And it really helps to understand so many rituals and so many strange sort of holidays that we maintain, which we can get into later. But in terms of the scapegoat of Hollywood and these unwanted children, for example, these I guess you would say that they were oppressed in a sense. Well, what happens inevitably is the audience will look at what Louis Mayer did, and they'll say, well, yeah, we tried your approach, and but clearly you favored something else, so we're going to go that way. And they just go the opposite way. That's how mirror neurons work. You're either synced up or you go the other way, unless you have another party that you can model after. But if you're modeling after somebody, you're either following or you're doing the opposite. It's very hard to do anything in between. And that's unfortunately how political parties, especially in the US, that's how they work. because as soon as one party starts going this way, then the other party just naturally will go the other way. It's like it's inevitable. Which it looks like a conspiracy. It looks like people are behind the scenes dictating. Okay, we're conservatives now are going to be 100% against abortion, and liberals are going to be for abortion up to 9 months, and that seems scripted. But I think that's just the nature of mirror neurons right there.
Do mirror neurons have a collective hive mind, operation, you think?
Yeah, and it operates through social media and news media and our mass media. I think that your most popular shows on Netflix and your mainstream network news, that's where you're going to find the hive mind, because people are logged into that stuff 24/7 now. People watch a lot of TV.
Do you think it's healthy to watch a lot of TV?
No.
How do you? How much is a lot of TV? or digital?
How much do they? I mean, people. When did I hear that because of the lockdown, people are consuming 8 hours of content?
Yeah.
And this is look. Let's differentiate what content is.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps you're learning for 6 hours a day. That's different, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you're watching 6 hours of how to learn to program C# in Unity, okay, great. Then you're watching, and perhaps that's entertaining. On the other hand, there's probably a lot of people that are watching entertainment in order to have some kind of cathartic release. And that's exactly what cathartic media does, is that it takes whatever's in your mirror neurons and allows you to dump it into the protagonist in your show. And there are thousands of shows for you to pick from. So you just got to find that character that's going to match up with your mirror neuron data, because that's how you sync up with a protagonist in a show. I mean, for me in the late 90s, it was Office Space. Right? I mean, my favorite movie, because I was a techie. I was a PHP programmer and doing Visual Basic at a community college, and couldn't stand the administrative department. Couldn't stand, that having to go and fix a printer all the time because the printer never worked. And Peter Gibbons in Office Space had the exact same issues that I had, and so I could sort of sync up with him and see myself in him. But that's not enough for a film. He has to actually do something with it. And what does he do? He comes up with some elaborate scheme with his buddies to take a bunch of money, and then they destroy the printer, and then they destroy the company, and that's very cathartic, and it's a very cathartic release. And that allows you, essentially, if you're hooked onto this kind of media, it allows you to keep dumping off all that mirror neuron data that you're soaking up all day, dump it into your protagonist, and then go to work the next day.
Yeah, that's right.
And
that's how politicians are too. Politicians are like they're like performance characters that you.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is probably addictive. I don't know how it couldn't be, because the dopamine release that you get from watching a narrative TV show, narrative movie, and being in a different character, it can't be zero. There has to be some kind of dopamine hit. And I don't know if they've studied this, and it's something that I would love to study myself someday. But if there's a dopamine hit from this, then that could explain why cathartic entertainment is so addictive.
Is there is there a way to have redeemed catharsis?
So it's catharsis, which the word catharsis in Greek just means cleanse. And it's a very sort of ancient understanding of when you have a spirit, when you're possessed by a spirit. And Ugo Leon wrote perfectly, one of the greatest books of all time is The Puppet of Desire. He explains this. I recommend that book highly. And that if you have taken on this spirit, then in order for you to get rid of the spirit, you have to cast it into some kind of idol, cast it onto somebody else, whatever it might be, to get rid of it. But for you to do that, you can't simply get rid of your spirit. As whatever spirit is haunting you, you can't simply do that. And I think that people absolutely do get possessed. I think that it's totally reality. Otherwise, every ancient religion, every ancient culture is lying. Every one of them is wrong.
And you believe it's a metaphysical thing. It's an entity. It's not just human scripts. right?
I
Some mimetic theorists would say it's just a mimetic feedback loop, right?
I don't know why it couldn't be both, because here's
Right,
the thing.
sure.
It could very much be both, but I do see it as metaphysical, because there's nothing you as a rational being can do to get rid of it. So you can't use your brain to get rid of it. It doesn't work.
How do you pick them up, first of all?
You pick them up through your mirror neuron system and various afflictions that might sort of. Sorry, I'm off. Oh, there we go. That's the, this is the $1 million question for ancient societies too. I mean, take for example, if you have a very peaceful society, right, a peaceful tribe, and they're on one side of a plateau, and on the other side of the plateau are the cannibals. And the cannibals are going to eat the peaceful tribe. Okay, so every day the peaceful tribe is watching the cannibals, sharpening their weapons, sharpening their blades, getting ready for the attack. The rain's coming, the water's coming up, they're going to float across pretty soon, and they're going to come and eat you. Okay, so for the past year, you have been watching their intentions. You've been watching their intentions to eat you, to kill you, and to do all these terrible things to you. That inevitably is going to invade your mirror neuron system, because anytime your brain perceives an intention from somebody else, it loads it in, whether you know it or not, unless you have mechanical failure of some kind. But humans are universal in this.
Every little slight intention. Wow.
Yeah, as long as you see it and perceive it, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And
it's the perception too, though, right? That's important, because you could intend something, but somebody thought you were scratching your head, but they thought you were flicking somebody off, and they perceive that intention, and that becomes
exactly. Yeah, and that's what makes humans so different than animals, is that we have such a crazy variety of ways that we can read intention. You put your hand behind your back, you could have a weapon, whereas with an animal, animals read intention too. That's how they fight. But with an animal, there's no way that they could be reaching for a baseball bat, right? Because they can't use tools. So it's a very limited number of intentions that could, different permutations that an animal might anticipate. And so animals just don't have nearly the elaborate mirror neuron system that humans do. So the peaceful tribe is just watching the cannibal tribe, and eventually somebody within the peaceful tribe is going to snap, because that intent load, which loads into your mirror neuron system, you have to do something with it. It has to get out. So the peaceful tribe has very beneficial rituals and different kind of exorcisms, because they have to get this stuff out. But then sometimes it breaks out in some kind of violent mimetic conflict. Somebody might lash out and attack his brother, for example, because that's just what you've been inundated with every day, and you could not get the catharsis so that it could get out. And so you end up acting on it. And so, that's just one way in which you could get the spirit of cannibalism within you. And who knows where the cannibal tribe got their spirit from. I mean, it was probably some kind of horrific event that causes a tribe to be cannibalistic. Who knows? They probably wouldn't tell you straight up. They would probably give you some story, some myth that would explain it.
Girard, but so the myth is a coping mechanism for the trauma, right? You would say in that case?
Yeah, I would say that the myth is the explanation. And it's a very succinct way of explaining the PTSD that everybody shares. Right, and then it explains all the rituals that you use to get rid of that PTSD. It's going to explain the spirits that you then put back in, because that's part of an exorcism. That a lot of the time Catholics they don't quite realize this when they do an exorcism, is that you have to have something that goes back in, because you can't leave a person uninhabited. What does it say? When you in the Bible, when you cast out a spirit, it goes off and brings 7 more back. So one has to go back in, and so that's why, and Gornoski writes about this, where when you have an exorcism, you have to then have a possession right as well for the spirit to go back in, and that spirit that goes back in is supposed to be the correct one, that is going to make you, if you're in the peaceful tribe, it's supposed to make you peaceful again. It's supposed to make you, I guess you would say that you've been educated to be in that tribe in the right way.
And you can get people to possess the right spirit in everyday life if they don't have access to a trusted exorcist, through positive role models, right?
Right, and yeah, again, it's not simply that you have. It's not simply that we all are possessed by some one demon and then it switches out for another one. It's a big. It's kind of a big. It's kind of a big blend, I guess you could say,
Of
because
good and bad, of good and bad angels like Looney Tunes, huh?
exactly. I mean, there's
Yeah.
a whole lot going on in the human brain, and
Yeah.
we can take a lot of good things, we can take a lot of bad things, and yeah, great mentors can help, and then as long as you're using discernment, your mentor is, everybody's flawed. You can't take the mentor, you can't take everything from the mentor. You can't take his vices as well. You're supposed to take only his good things.
One of the big themes I think a lot of people are talking about lately is, how to know uh, whether, well, some folks have said don't imitate Jesus. Don't imitate Jesus. I typically tell people do imitate Jesus, but I understand how you can get nuance there and try to parse that out a little bit. But how do you imitate? How do you follow Jesus or act the way he wants us to act in context of the ordinary situations that we find ourselves in, where it feels like if you imitate Jesus, sometimes in certain situations you're just going to be a doormat that you're going to be taken advantage of and abused, and and so in that case, imitating the take up your cross justifies accepting abuse, whether it's individual, relationship, or societally, And then somebody said to me, no, we don't want to imitate Jesus when it comes to politics. We need Constantine. We need a little bit of proactive, defense. We need a bodyguard, We need someone to protect the good stuff. So, any thoughts on that about, when do you take care of yourself and defend yourself, both on a relational level and a societal level? And then when do you lay down your right to mimetically reciprocate evil done unto you, and take up your cross and turn the other cheek, that kind of thing?
From what I remember, the Messiah, I just call him the Messiah or Yeshua by his Hebrew name. When the Messiah said to follow me, not to copy me. Now, by following him, you're also supposed to follow the way I understand it is you're supposed to follow his life and the Torah that he kept, and that's one very baseline level that I personally do is I follow the Torah. Obviously, I can't do animal sacrifices. There's no temple, which is a very interesting topic in and of itself, is animal sacrifice, because the Old Testament is full of this lead up to the ultimate sacrifice of the lamb. But I would say that there's a lot, I think, that people don't pay much attention to when Messiah called the Pharisees hypocrites. He was a pretty straightforward guy. I don't think he was much of a hippie. Doesn't seem like he was. He called the Pharisees hypocrites. He argued with them. He fought them. He also escaped death multiple times. They tried to push him off a cliff, and he didn't allow that. And he would, and so this is a very big eschatological question as to whether or not we should be exactly like him, and at the age of 34 or 37, take up our cross and die. I'm not quite sure that that's what he wanted. Seems like the answer is a little bit, I don't know, perhaps it's a little more human than that, because the Torah is full of reciprocation. There is no indication in Torah that you're supposed to stand there and take punishment. Now, what Messiah's advice is don't escalate. And I agree with that. There's a very cogent point there about not escalating violence, but that doesn't mean that you don't seek justice. I absolutely think that you can do both at the same time.
So, if we're in this crisis of going kind of back to our original starting point of media and all of this attempt to sacrifice the good tradition of family and differentiation, all those things, if we're seeing that all around us, how does one respond to that? Does one act like William Wallace, or does one act a little more like Jesus? Does one say it's time to make an alliance with a little bit of pagan aggressive people to kind of make sure we can get our family values transmitted, or do we say no? We gotta do this in a cruciform way. You know what I mean? Any thoughts on that? I mean, I know that's kind of a vague way to look at it, but there's a certain feeling I'm trying to kind of wrestle with that I hear a lot in today's media.
Yeah, yeah, I hear that, and I can't. That's such a big question. I mean, I would just give this example. I mean, when I first was married, we had this debate many times about even self-defense. If somebody breaks into the house and starts trying to kill us, do we have the right to defend ourselves? And at a certain point, I just said, I don't care. I'm going to do it. And this is not an easy question to answer. When do you? Because on the one hand, also, the Yahweh appoints the leaders. He appoints kings. He appoints presidents, whether we like it or not. And there's this question of, well, do we bow down and serve the evil emperor? Well, is the evil emperor preventing us from keeping the commandments? If he is, then maybe we shouldn't be serving him. Is the evil emperor killing innocent children? Perhaps we shouldn't allow that.
When you look at the destruction of beauty in today's, like you were saying, retconning of 80s innocence, is that because of the digital age coming in? The digital age providing all these different perspectives through the decentralized windows to the world that we have with smartphones and so forth, that we can be suspicious of myths to a degree where we can't. I'm trying to say how to explain this. You said in the 80s everything looked great, and then 90s globalism blew up. Is that because of the digital age? Is that because of the access to the internet, that everybody could have a perspective and everybody could remember every little detail, and it fractured narrative so much that when we look at the 80s, it feels calm and tranquil and relaxed compared to where we're at now? I guess that's where I want to go.
Okay, it sounds like there's two things there. So I think that the first part is that shift in the mid 90s. it might have been partially internet, although not many people really knew how to use the internet, but there probably was a general feeling that people have more of a say in things, although that is far different. It's far more the case now than it was in the mid 90s. But I think also in the mid 90s, you just had a concerted effort by studios and by content creators to reach the biggest audience possible. And when you create media that's lowest common denominator, then you're just inevitably going to have DVD covers with 3 faces on it, a landscape, and 3 names, right? That's what DVDs looked like for years. So I think that shift then was much more about just trying to capture the most ticket sales. I think it was simple, and this is just what globalism does. And then when it comes to destroying the beauty, well, social media does. I mean, it works wonders on people because, and not wonders, it works terrors on people because, I mean, especially young people who there's no freedom anymore for anybody if you're on social media. The minute that you voice an opinion, suddenly you're sort of at the mercy of the mob. And this is also why we have such a different kind of language structure than we did even when I was in high school. Everybody wants to qualify things by saying it's just my opinion, and it's just, in my humble opinion, just for me personally, not for everybody else.
And they do upspeak.
Yeah, because it's a question. Everything's like, oh, is this okay for me to say this? Exactly.
I really agree with you. And you're like, do you agree or not?
Well, I don't know. I mean, do you? Yeah. And it's this sort of fear of being certain about something.
Yeah. Very postmodern.
Very gray, very postmodern. Yeah. Very gray. A lot of films are like this now. They just don't really, they try not to take a side. It's very strange. Korean films do this a lot now too. There's a lot of these kind of gray morality films in Korea, which they're beautiful films, but the stories sometimes are just baroque and terrible.
I would think that the Western films are a little bit more preachy, aren't they? You know, you have Star Wars, you have all these movies that are coming out. I saw that new show on Netflix about the girl who's the sister of Sherlock Holmes. I don't know if you saw that. But some new series, and the whole story is about, hey, yeah, her mother wants to blow up Parliament because she's a radical left-wing anarchist, and she's the hero who says, no, we don't need to blow up the Parliament. I'll solve everything by being, you know, the female, you know, God that defeats all the patriarchs the simpler way. We're going to sacrifice a few. We don't have to blow up the whole thing. And I was like, and so that's very preachy though, right? But I understand there's gray, and then there's these preachy stories that seem to be the most popular, right?
Yeah. Well, I think that when you have gray media, Jack Dorsey said it himself, that they are re-examining the word evil. They don't really know if they agree with that word anymore. So I think that there's a lot of things that we can still agree on are evil, but I mean, sometimes I'm not so sure. Sometimes I wonder if my saying that the child trafficking is evil, there's this backlash where they say, well, wait a minute, are you a conspiracy theorist? And it's like, well, wait a minute, hold on, can we just agree on something? And no, it still has to be gray because it's very politicized. And there's a fear of trying to identify the good from the evil.
Because they don't want to differentiate.
That's right.
Because they're so haunted by the cross, they're afraid that if they say child trafficking is evil, they'll scapegoat some innocent child trafficker who had good intentions or something. I mean, it's ultimately nihilism. It's insanity.
Yeah, perhaps.
But why would Jesus, here's the thing. Why would Jesus leave us in this situation? It feels like utter, madness that we've been left in because we've been deprived of the scapegoat mechanism. So we can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again, as I tell my friends on radio. We can't stitch that. We can't put the cat back in the bag. The cat's out of the bag. We know the magic trick of sacrifice, and we're still trying it like an old addiction that we can't quit. But we know it's bad for us, and we keep hitting the heroin or whatever you want to call metaphor, and we know it's wrong. We're addicted as can be to it, and it doesn't seem like we have, like you said, a good spirit readily available for us to put into our society to replace the madness of this post-sacrificial world we're in.
Yeah, I mean, we used to have very safe scapegoats. They were vampires, werewolves, zombies. They were very safe. You know, these did not correspond to people directly. I mean, sure, there might have been political overtones with zombies, for example, but by and large, it was very safe to scapegoat a vampire. It was kind of the equivalent of animal sacrifice. And yeah, of course, Messiah did deprive us of the sacrifice, but keep in mind too, when the second temple burned down, the animal sacrifice was gone as well. When the first temple burned down, animal sacrifice was gone. What did they do? And what did they do? They were in Babylon. What could they have done? They didn't have a temple to sacrifice at. And so these are, the thing about sacrifice is that it is endemic to humans. There's no human society that doesn't sacrifice. They all sacrifice something, and it's just it is built in. It's how we work. It is the way that we cleanse, and we might be under the impression that we're beyond that. We're beyond child sacrifice. I would never kill my child. Okay, let's see. I mean, it just takes different forms. A lot of the time, it goes in the form of media.
Yeah,
it takes a lot of different forms. So
yeah, you're right. You get kids growing up with a smartphone on their face since the moment they're born. That is a form of slow sacrifice. You're checking them out of reality so you don't have to deal with it. That's true.
Yeah, I get it. I mean, that is one way of looking at a smartphone. Yeah.
It's slow, like, I don't have to deal with you. You check out. It's a slow sacrifice because they're being excluded. Sacrifice doesn't have to be a death. It doesn't have to be physical in the direct sense.
It's expulsion.
Violence. It's expulsion. So if you're being expelled to the world of digital media from the moment you're alive, That's a slow form of exclusion.
Yeah.
If you're not getting human touch and human interaction and human play. And
And
then
don't get me wrong.
the junk
And,
food that kids are fed too is another
yeah.
type of slow sacrifice, right?
Yeah,
Would you
yeah,
agree?
yeah. It's in the interest of allowing the parents to save money, keep them from
Happy?
having to work too hard. Yeah, keep them happy. And the parents would rather they would rather have this than to give their child health. And that's just the thing is, the unfortunate reality is that sacrifice works really well. It's one of the it's a guarantee that if you sacrifice, then your society will do well. It's a guarantee. That is the foundation of human civilization, is the sacrifice. And
even with Jesus now?
I'm sorry?
Even with the breaking of the scapegoat mechanism with the
It's not broken though. We still scapegoat. It didn't break.
Yeah.
We still sacrifice all the time. It's just hidden. We do things very differently now. I think sacrifice takes the form of media. It takes a lot of different forms. It's just underground and it's not as overt. So, for example, if you look at the Mayans, this is the most advanced civilization that Cortez had ever seen, the biggest city that he's ever seen, and they were some of the most devout child sacrificers in the world, and it worked really well. Worked really well to build up the society. It works incredibly well.
How did that correspond for folks who? Let's go back just for a moment, just to flesh that out a little bit. How did best technology, best organized society he'd seen correspond to, well, our secret, it's right over here. Let me show you what we do. How does that connect?
Because if you are willing to give up your child, then you have basically said that I'm willing to defer everything and give up my progeny in order to continue some kind of trajectory, right, and not derail everything.
Okay. It
allows me as a king to continue. If I sacrifice my son, even though I lose my heir, I then can continue with the plan. Nothing's going to change. And once you, if you just look at a line graph, the societies that did more overt sacrifices just did a lot better. Yeah. And I don't know. I'm reluctant to say that this is morally acceptable. It's obviously not. It's not morally acceptable to sacrifice somebody. But tell that to Japanese people in the 15th century who would put a person under a pillar when they put a bridge up, and the bridge would stay up. Right? Of course, that might have just been the time when the bridge managed to stand up. But that's the myth that they build up, and that's how innovation is laid. And that's how, the founding stone of buildings in, you would have the foundation stone in the corners of the house in Alaska. They would put a body under the house. They would kill a body. They would build children into walls.
When was that happening still? Or
I think it was happening in Alaska up until the 1800s.
The native tribes there?
Yeah, I would recommend looking at H. Clay Trumbull's book, Threshold Covenant and Blood Covenant. Huh. And those books detail grisly detail. And you could say on the one hand, this guy was just being, prejudiced against the native tribes, and obviously he lied, but it's not a lie. There was human sacrifices everywhere. It happened in all advanced societies and all non-advanced societies. Everybody had it. It's not a lie. Girard said so. Girard pointed out one time too that he had a PBS documentary showing these children that were children's bones on the top of mountains. Clearly, they had been left there in Latin America to be exposed. And then various scholars come out and they say, "There's no way that we would do that. This is racism that they're even pointing this out." No, don't. It's not. That's not the case, because everybody did it. Everybody's guilty.
And that's what's behind, not to go off topic too far here, but that's what's behind the woke stuff, is that it's an attempt to try to hide human culpability for sacrifice into collective identities.
Let's look at it from the other perspective. If you look at Fraser and you look at even Freud, he had a lot of great data about human sacrifice and rituals. They had amazing data Unfortunately, these guys, they were racist. They really did see themselves as better than these lower people, which is just disgusting. But unfortunately, what modern society does now is that they say, well, therefore the data is racist, which is not true. The data is great. The interpretation was racist. Throw away the interpretation, keep the data, because unfortunately there's no more data being collected about this.
Mm-hmm.
So the data is very good. I understand, well, again, this is the mirror neuron thing where you just go at the opposite no matter what. But if we could sort of be reasonable for a second and say, okay, let's look at all of Fraser's data, the Golden Bough and these compendiums that he put together, or the Florentine Codex about the Aztecs. You know, there was a big controversy for a long time about whether or not the Aztecs actually sacrificed people. It's a nonsensical debate. You know, there was a question about whether the Carthaginians sacrificed children in the urns, and you know, all these scholars came out, tried to defend Carthage in Tunisia and in Italy, saying, "Oh, there's no way that this could have possibly been real. These are graves. These are just monuments." But no, it's very much the case that this was child sacrifice. But that doesn't mean that the data is racist. That means that the data is universal because everybody did this. And in the West, we just have a very clever way of hiding it.
I would say that because the West has had Christianity uninterrupted as a little longer than some cultures, that it has been able to expel some of the more overt forms of sacrifice, and where sacrifice continues to persist, we are bothered by it. I mean,
Yes.
The fact that no one can agree on who to blame for the Chinese,
Right.
the Wuhan coronavirus. They can't agree.
Right.
Some say it's Donald Trump. Millions believe that.
Yep.
But millions of others don't believe it's him, and they believe it's
Yeah.
something else. So,
Right.
so you see what I mean? Just as it China, you
Yep.
can't even say China without denoting some kind of scapegoating language there.
Yeah.
But you see what I mean? Like I think we have had some progress against the scapegoat mechanism. But you're right. It's like a disease. It's like a cancer. The more you cut it here, it hides and grows and metastasizes into another part of the body. You know.
Yeah, I think that we've managed to get rid of the very overt forms of human sacrifice, and we have now taken it up. We've become very vain in believing that we're somehow above it now. And I think that's sort of the modern conceit, because I mean, let's look, for example, in India in the 1800s when they used to burn widows on the pyre with the husband, and the British outlawed that. But at the same time, I mean, Christianity really did a number on Jews throughout all the centuries following Messiah, and the Jews were a very handy scapegoat for Christians because the Jews were supposedly this like forgotten class of people, which is just not true. Yahweh made a covenant with these people. The covenant still stands. The covenants don't die. And so, I agree with you. Where Christianity spread, there were a lot of overt forms of human sacrifice that were overturned. But as we know, in these very Christianized societies, it was often the Jews that were blamed for a plague, because the Jews are the ones that would wash their hands, and they wouldn't get it a lot of the time because they would wash their hands, and they had cleanliness rituals that the Christians did not.
It's interesting. So what do you think Jesus accomplished on the cross?
In order to really understand, and not that I understand it fully, but in order to understand what happened on the cross, I think you have to understand the priesthood, which is a thorough reading of Exodus and Leviticus, and part of Numbers too. And the priesthood, if you go way back to, putting on my Gansian hat, if you go back to the founding moment of humanity, when there was the first, when you had basically the first moment of the first human. See, what Gans does is he basically says that humans began with language and the sacred. It was all at the same time. And so there was a moment then at the very beginning when you compare it to alpha-beta relations with animals. The alpha chimpanzee kills the game, delivers it however he sees fit. The beta chimpanzees can challenge him. If they fail, they get knocked down the ladder again, and the alpha remains alpha. At a certain point, Gans's view is that at a certain point, there arose a human, man, who was able to transcend that alpha-beta relation, because by virtue of the mirror neurons, when the alpha male, the alpha man was around all the beta men, and you had the carcass of the animal at the center, he realized that through mirror neurons, that they were all able to use weapons against him and create some kind of mob activity that would take him down. And so what he did was he deferred, he emitted some kind of signal that we have to avert violence and just divide the animal up equally. And so that's called the originary scene in generative anthropology.
So they went on a hunt, they killed an animal, and the guy who's been leading the tribe, or whatever, proto-tribe, realizes that if he doesn't play it straight here, that there's more of the mob against, that he's the king and they're the mob, and the mob's going to tear him apart. So
Exactly.
he says, let's cut this gently, but does he get a little extra for himself there?
Well, probably, because I mean, by virtue of maybe being a better fighter, there's going to be some, some
hierarchy,
logical,
right?
Yeah, there's going to be some tit for tat there, obviously, but. And so at that moment, then, when he raises that, and we don't know what that sign was, but there had to be some kind of a sign that designated that central victim, the animal. And again, this is where Gans probably differs from Girard significantly, because in Girard's view, that central piece is a human, but in Gans's view, it could have been a piece of meat, for example, could have been a game. At that moment, when the signal designates the game as something, there's some kind of sign where everybody stops, they defer, they wait a minute. Now that central item becomes sacred, because we're all now deferring, waiting for that item to be distributed equally. And that's a very religious experience. That's a miracle, because it's just like the scapegoat mechanism, where how could this dead being provide peace? How could this dead animal provide the means for us to avert total catastrophe? We don't know. It just did. Let's make sure we do it exactly the same next time. So then what you do is you basically have to create a process, right? And it's somebody's job to remember the process. You emit the sign, you pull the knife out, you do the XYZ, make sure you do it the same, otherwise you're going to have crisis. You're going to have this violent mimetic contagion that's going to destroy society. We've seen it done, we don't want it done again. So you have a process. The person that's in charge of keeping that process exactly the same every time is the priest. That's what a priesthood is. And so that priesthood is what keeps the world from destroying itself. And the priesthood also maintains the myth, and that myth might change over time. That myth might say, yeah, the animal was I don't know, I'm making it up. He came from the woods and he laid down his life so that we may, live, right? It's just a very simple mythology. And over time that's going to work. But at a certain point, there might be cracks in the story. So it's in the priest's interest to make sure that story is consistent. And that's why the priests have always had the corner on storytelling in myth making. They're the ones that keep that. They're the scribes. They're the ones that have the language skills. They're the ones that maintain all that, and they disseminate it. And the difference with the Bible was that in Hebrew, it was very easy for the average person to understand Hebrew and pick up Hebrew and read it. So it was sort of, I don't want to call it democratized, but it was very easily accessible to everybody. It wasn't just the priests who knew all this stuff. Everybody sort of had a grasp on all of this. And so the priests through the Bible, they're in charge of maintaining the story. They're in charge of maintaining the truth. And they also have an extreme responsibility. And if they mess up, they die. If you give the wrong fire, you die. Right? If you go into the Holy of Holies on the wrong day or with the wrong linens, then you die.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so if you can understand how that priesthood functioned and the importance of that, then we might be able to understand how Messiah is our high priest now up in the Shemayim in the heavens, who has become our eternal priest according to the book of Hebrews. Because there's no temple. How do we have a priest aside from him?
And so in this view, what was accomplished on the cross here was that that he became. Do you have a particular way to read that for people or explain?
The only way that I could see it, I mean, he's the Lamb, But what does that exactly mean? If he is our high priest, then that would mean that he is atoning for us at all times, and that we have a conduit through which to get rid of this unwanted mirror neuron data. But it's through him, and it's on us to understand what we need to do in our daily lives to make sure that we're following the commandments properly, because those are the ones that he professed. And my understanding is that if we follow the commandments, then we will not have an issue with that mirror neuron data, and we can get it out because he's doing it for us. That's a very sort of like neurological / metaphysical way that I look at it, but it's the only way that I can really understand what happened, because I've been studying the Torah now, the first 5 books of the Bible, for the past 3 years. And every time I read through the priesthood, you get a little bit more information, you get a little bit more, and you start to see how Messiah, as our high priest, took on those qualities, because the temple was raised soon after he died, and it had to have happened for a reason.
The timing of those two events are not coincidence for you.
Yeah. I mean, it was all predicted too. Mm-hmm. He predicted it.
And so the Torah is, how does one follow the Torah in a way that allows for that mirror neuron junk to get relief? It gets relief from the following of Torah, or from what Jesus does on our soul level as a result of that? Or, I'm trying to put some action steps here.
Yeah, I know, it's okay. I mean, I do follow the Torah. I wear the fringes. I do everything that I possibly can to stay true to that, because I don't know any better. I can't pretend to know better than that. And I keep the Shabbat, keep the Sabbath on Saturday. And, this is all very controversial stuff. Every time I talk about this with Christians, they tend to cringe and they don't want to hear it. But you asked. And how would I recommend doing it? I mean, this is how I've been doing it for 3 years now. And there's healing, absolutely. I've had my own hang-ups in life. And so there are some times when things just don't make sense, but I've been following the commandments, and then things just start working out.
Pretty good.
So it's beyond me.
Yeah. The thing that people, I think, are looking for right now is they're looking for answers about action. What can they do? Because a lot of people invested a lot of hope in the political scene, and that didn't work out for a lot of folks in a lot of different ways, and they were hoping, I think people who are not into the neoliberal globalist consensus, they were hoping Trump could bring about some kind of American renaissance. It doesn't look like that's going to happen.
Absolutely.
I think a lot of people saw that coming, but here we are again. And people
and I think that's a great segue into what's going on right now, because so many people put their faith in a figurehead. Mm-hmm. And whether it's one side or the other, if you are putting your faith in a man, how well did that work out for the right? Did things really change all that much? It doesn't seem like culture really changed. It seems like culture is just kind of going to do its thing no matter what Trump does. And if you are one to attach yourself to a person and idolize a person, then that's going to really depress you, and you're going to have a hard time getting up in the morning. But if you know that there's a plan, and that we have a high priest, and that the work on the cross is real, and that is how we come to the truth, then there's nothing to worry about. And you're not going to attach yourself to idols like that. And an idol is a person in this case.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So there's a way to idolize Jesus too, isn't there? To objectify Jesus, would you say?
How so?
To turn him into an object rather than the subject of your life.
Yeah, if he becomes a
social status marker.
Social status, exactly. Unfortunately, and look, the Girardians are going to hate me for this, but on the Facebook groups, the Girardians have taken a very political tone, where I remember when Trump was elected, they all said, Trump is scapegoating everybody, and he's clearly the guy who's scapegoating everybody, and everybody's hating on Trump, and I'm kind of going, maybe that's true, but y'all are doing that to him.
Yeah.
And it became very a very sort of, I don't know, a very status driven moment where they say, like, yeah, see, we're Girardians and we know what scapegoating is. We don't do that because Trump does that. And you kind of sit back and go, looks like you're doing that.
So what do you think is the answer for society? Do we need to create media? Because you said the priests were the recorders of the story. So if we want to be tellers of the true story, the story of Jesus, the Messiah, the change of the world that took place with him, that means we got to make media, right? Because the media today is the priestly caste holdover from the ancient time. And that's why the media has such an incestuous relationship with state power and corporations. Yes. I don't think it's a conspiracy. People keep thinking it's a conspiracy that the media keeps regurgitating all this stuff. No, they've always been this way. Yeah. I guess I have to be fair, because there has been like those noble journalists that come out and they write truth to power. I'm thinking about, what's that guy? Gary Webb, who wrote he exposed the CIA was moving crack into LA to fund the Iran-Contra deal. Mm-hmm. And, he got miserable treatment by all of his media colleagues. Yeah, sure. So there's always that underdog hero who follows Christ and tells the story, but those are outliers. The true record of media is always that it's the priestly caste that's mediating the reality of what the state is allowed to do in its corporate or aristocratic allies, right?
Yep, that's absolutely spot on.
So So we're supposed to be media, though, because Jesus says we're to be priests, right?
Well, look what's happening right now. It's very obvious that media has caused a huge fissure in the audience. There's a large chunk of the audience that doesn't believe the media anymore, right? And like it or not, Trump was someone that really tried to poke a hole in this as well, by calling it fake news, and it's become a buzzword, fake news, and we all laugh at it. At the same time, it shows that there's a large percentage of the population that does not trust the priesthood anymore. And so when your priesthood stops being reliable, then your myth is being debunked. And the priests have to sort of double down and figure out a way to fix this. I mean, a great example is when Netflix released Cuties, which is it's borderline pedophilia, this film, and it released it on the streaming service. And a lot of people, even throughout the political spectrum, they said, hey, you shouldn't be showing kids like this. This is dead wrong. And Netflix sort of doubled down. The people that are, I guess you would say, the media elites doubled down on it. And I think that they lost a lot of credibility. So then the question is, how do they make up for that? Do they keep doubling down and try and shift the narrative so that people will start being okay with this stuff? Perhaps it is going to go that way. Perhaps at some point, though, I mean, that does leave a huge opening for someone who has the means of creating films, creating video games, creating something in between film and video game, because you can use the same tools for both now, to create some media that actually tells the truth. And the question then is, what is your distribution channel? Which is a huge question, right? Because if you're going through Netflix, then you're kind of back at square one. So then the question becomes, how do you use, we have the tools that we need, but how do we use distribution channels to make sure that people actually see it and that it doesn't get swept under the algorithm rug?
And that's what we have to figure out.
I don't think it's an easy solution, because you see a lot of social media popping up that's trying to compete with Twitter and compete with Facebook. I think Parler is one of them, but it looks exactly like Twitter. It just functions on the other side of the spectrum. So again, it's the mirror neuron thing. It's just people going the opposite direction. So you're kind of just doing the same thing. I don't think it'll actually end any differently. So there's got to be some kind of, I would think that there might be some innovation out there that allows for a more, what would you say, a more free distribution network to get the truth out.
Like a different web, or
I don't know.
Yeah,
I'm not the tech guy that I used to be.
Yeah,
and unfortunately, once you open up these portals to these other kinds of distribution channels, you get a lot of weird junk going through there too. You get a lot of conspiracy theories that are not true. You get a ton. A lot of it is anti-Semitic, which is just crazy. I don't know why this always happens. This seems to keep happening on right-wing media, where you have people trying to tell the truth on the one hand, and then you just get a bunch of anti-Semites in there as well. I don't know why this keeps happening. It seems to me that that's the wrong way to do it.
Yeah.
So I'm just looking at ways that it's been done incorrectly, and we think, okay, how do we keep on like sidestepping this? And then maybe it's more, David, maybe it's more like, subversive entertainment in the 60s and 70s and the 80s, entertainment that was trying to go against the status quo, which, you're talking about a time when things were relatively conservative. And so you had a lot of media that was trying to be subversive, but it had to hide it. It had to do it really smart. And that's actually some really great entertainment. I mean, just look at Yellow Submarine, for example. Yellow Submarine is all about drug use in a very conservative time in the UK. And it was the Blue Meanies are the government of the UK, and it's all about free love and free drugs. And that was a very subversive message, but it looks like a kids movie. And that film has gone down in history. And so it's not that we necessarily have to agree with the message of those films, but perhaps the techniques are something that we can borrow from. It's kind of like borrowing the data from Frasier and not the analysis. We're going to borrow the process and not the content from subversive content in the past, perhaps.
Do you ever look at McLuhan for any of these ideas? There's good stuff there. I've seen Marshall McLuhan with the media as the message, media ecology.
Now, what is this?
Marshall McLuhan. He's a media ecologist from Canada. He was famous for saying the medium is the message. The idea of the environment of media is what's actually shaping us, not so much the content. It's kind of similar, dovetails with some of the things we've talked about a little bit today. But I think it's interesting to think about these things and think about action points. Is there any piece of media that you could point to as an example of doing it right? A stand-up comedy or a movie or a video game or and first, so there's that first question. And the second question is, should we focus on art right now, or news media in terms of the telling the story? You can tell the story on hey, this is what's happening right now, these guys are corrupt, this is bad, or you can tell the high level symbolic art again and just go back there. So
yeah. I'm a sucker for doing it the artistic way. I mean, call me biased because that's my field.
Yeah.
But I think that you can tell a hell of a lot more narrative in a piece of art than you can in news media. With news media, you just if you're trying to play by the rules of the house and try and subvert the house, you're just not going to win. The house will always win. And I would just say, if you have a problem with the news media, then just walk away from it and don't try and make your own competing news media. It'll just get swallowed up. I'd say the same about social media. And, this is where innovation is going to lie, is people walking away. And this is one of the reasons I moved to Las Vegas, is because I just had to get out of the track I was on in California, and I just needed to go out to the desert with my family and say, okay, what am I doing now? I just need a clean slate, and that helped me to see an opening, and I took it, and that's been very good for me during the pandemic, because while many other media companies shut down and many film projects dried up, a lot of stunt work dried up, the work that we were doing did not dry up because we are a remote motion capture studio. And so that's just one example where walking away and getting away from all the stuff that you sort of fill your day with, the podcasts, which, much as I love those, sometimes I if I'm listening to podcasts, I can't really think. I can't think of new ideas. And so I'll just stop listening to them for a while, stop listening to the news. And I find that the less I listen to the news and the less that I'm sort of in this cultural spirit of following the election and everything that's going on, if I can just get away from that, then suddenly things get a lot clearer. And then I think you get more ideas that way.
That's very good. So walking away from this mass media is a good advice to take away from this discussion. You talked about video games. Is there any video games, or I've always thought of that as an underappreciated medium for communicating the true story? Like how do we?
Yeah.
That would be so interesting to think about, how to make a video game that unveils the scapegoat mechanism in a way that leads people to the truth, you know?
Yeah.
In a way you can have.
Yeah, I mean, you could do all kinds of interesting stuff with video games, and it's getting easier and easier to make video games. A guy like me is kind of able to make a video game at this point. You know, and I'm not much of a techie. I can work my way around the 3D programs out there, but what you're going to see now too is people leveraging using video game platforms. So both game consoles, you know, PlayStation 5 and Xbox, and also 3D design applications like Unity and Unreal. These are almost ecosystems where you can create a game or you can create a movie or something in between. And a lot of people are going to these things to create movies. And I've made a couple now, and it's incredibly, it's amazing what you can do with no money in these things. You can make your movie about going to the moon. You can make your movie that takes place in ancient Rome for nothing. You spend $200 to make your movie. It's just going to get easier and easier. And so when you open up the pathways like that, the flood channels, you open up the means of creating content, then the priesthood needs to look out, right? And the priesthood needs to, okay, we got to make sure our story's straight. Otherwise, we're going to have a ton of competition. Yeah. And all this competition, we have to do either one of two things. We either have to get rid of it, or we just need to shut off the distribution channels.
And I think they're already lost. They've already lost because, like I was saying this before on my program, that they wouldn't be. The left-wing content that they're putting out wouldn't feel so viscerally preachy for average normies that are watching this stuff. Like, normies are people who are not into the political, cultural debate. They're just sitting there like, what is this? This is preachy, heavy left-wing stuff in Star Wars. Right. Purple-haired ladies bossing everybody. I mean, come on, stop trying so hard. It's too much. And when you see them try so hard, that's a sign that they don't have hegemony anymore. You know? Because if something's deeply owning the culture, you don't feel the need to make a preachy piece of media, and neither does the average person who's in the middle feel the preachiness. They're just like, yes, this is the way it is. This is the way, you know? And
I would say that preachy media on both sides is just really terrible right now. Like, you look at some conservative content too, and it really goes overboard as well.
But they've always been preachy. They don't know how to make art since
they really don't know how to make art very well at all, and that's the problem. That's a big problem for conservatives. Is if they want to get a message out, they got to learn how to make art. And they just, I don't know, they want to say, I mean, it kind of looks like Chinese propaganda when they make art, you know? It's just, it looks like Red Dawn, right? It looks like Red Dawn, which is just, okay, so take it for what it is, but it did not go down. It's not going to be in the Criterion collection, right? What you want is to be able to make something that gets in the Criterion collection. It has to be able to pass that sniff test.
Well, very good. Hey, Eric, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I think we had a great free-flowing discussion about media and our steps that we can take forward here. You know, I think people need to just, like you said, walking away from so much of this media and getting unclogged, you know, getting all that bad influence, those bad role models and bad spirits from people unclogged out of your system and filling it with good role models.
Absolutely.
Certainly things we need to be more mindful of.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me on the show.
Thank you.